Peacetime in the Strait of Hormuz is defined by a constant, massive flow of energy. This narrow channel functions as the heart of the global market, transporting 20% of the world's daily oil supply into the Arabian Sea. That stability vanished in early 2026. Following the outbreak of the US-Israeli war with Iran, President Donald Trump imposed a strict naval blockade on all Iranian ports, aiming to throttle Tehran's maritime access. The impact was instantaneous. As Iran threatened to retaliate against any passing vessel, commercial traffic through the strait plummeted by 95%. For global logistics, the situation was unprecedented. Hundreds of energy carriers were forced to idle in open, dangerous waters, unable to reach their destinations or exit the Gulf. The economic consequences reached far beyond the coastline. War risk insurance premiums for vessels in the Arabian Sea spiked from a fraction of a percent to over 5% of a ship's hull value, making transit too expensive for almost any commercial operator. To prevent a total collapse of global shipping, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation launched a $40 billion reinsurance facility. It was an emergency attempt to backstop a market that had essentially frozen. This single choke point closure turned a commercial artery into a combat zone. The result was a massive security vacuum that left the regional powers of the Arabian Sea with a choice: retreat or mobilize. On the Pakistani coast, the economic toll was visible in the empty berths of its major ports. With insurance costs making commercial shipping impossible, trade was reduced to local fishing craft and small-scale harbor activity. To maintain essential trade, Islamabad authorized an emergency overland truck corridor. The goal was to bypass the U.S. naval blockade by hauling Iranian goods through Pakistan by road. This move suddenly gave Gwadar Port a new strategic role. Located on a hammer-shaped peninsula, it provided a direct entry for overland cargo. But sitting just 170 kilometers from Iran, the port was now positioned squarely within the crossfire of the blockade. The risk was so high that India completely abandoned its own $370 million investment in Iran's nearby Chabahar Port, exiting the project to avoid being caught in the U.S. sanctions net. Gwadar, the $54 billion centerpiece of China's Belt and Road Initiative, had become a massive vulnerability. It was now an active target for interdiction, caught between the needs of a blockaded Iran and the pressure of the U.S. Navy. While its rivals were paralyzed by the blockade, New Delhi moved to exploit the vacuum. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government recognized an opportunity to secure India's energy interests through direct military force. The Indian Navy launched a massive escalation of Operation Sankalp. Heavily armed task forces were deployed into the Gulf of Oman, moving aggressively to assert control over the region's vital shipping lanes. These task forces maintained a continuous presence east of Hormuz. Their primary mission was to provide active military escorts for Indian-flagged tankers, ensuring they could navigate contested waters safely. The stakes were critical for India's energy security. By escorting massive LPG carriers and crude oil tankers, the Navy prevented the nationwide fuel shortages that were beginning to cripple neighboring economies. Beyond simple escorts, the Navy expanded its role to include boarding operations, intercepting maritime smugglers, and rescuing hijacked vessels. By the time the crisis peaked, the operation had successfully secured over 1.5 million tons of cargo and protected hundreds of seafarers who would otherwise have been stranded. By stepping into the void left by others, India established itself as the primary security provider in the Arabian Sea. It successfully used the cover of a global crisis to secure its energy lifelines, while its regional rivals remained sidelined. As the initial shock of the war passed, the region emerged with a restructured balance of naval power. The tactical maneuvers of the Indian Navy had translated into a new strategic reality. Look at the dual-use intent behind China's investment in Gwadar. Designed as a strategic strongpoint, the infrastructure supports more than cargo. Its deepwater berths were scaled to dock the largest assets of the Chinese Navy, including aircraft carriers and amphibious assault ships. But the blockade has turned this military asset into a liability. Gwadar is now an isolated outpost, vulnerable to U.S. interdiction, and surrounded by a fully mobilized Indian naval presence. Beijing now faces a critical decision. Will China deploy its naval forces into the Arabian Sea to protect its investment and challenge the US blockade? The risks are extreme. Sending the Chinese Navy to confront the blockade would bring two major world powers into a direct military standoff, creating a risk of nuclear escalation that few in Beijing are willing to take. If Beijing stands down, the blockade on Iran achieves a dual result. While it cripples Pakistan's maritime commerce, it simultaneously formalizes India's role as the primary guardian of the Western Indian Ocean's most critical shipping lanes.